The 1920s in America were a dazzling spectacle of jazz, dancing, sharp suits, and flapper dresses. It was an era known for energy, style, and illegal booze. That's right. Welcome to one of the strangest, most ironic chapters in American history, Prohibition. A time when the United States banned alcohol, and Americans became even more obsessed with it. To understand how the nation ended up in this bizarre situation, we have to rewind all the way back to the 1800s, an era when Americans drank like it was a professional sport. By 1830, the average American over the age of 15 was consuming about 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year. That's 3 times today's average of 2.5 gallons, per the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism's 2021 study, and COVID may have inflated that average. Imagine drinking 1.5 bottles of whiskey every single week and still managing to show up at church on Sunday. It wasn't exactly a model of moderation. This widespread drunkenness sparked what can only be described as a moral panic. The result? The rise of the temperance movement, a unique cocktail of religious fervor, public health advocacy, and a nationwide case of, "We're sick of Uncle Mo getting hammered before dinner." Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, and the Anti-Saloon League emerged as vocal advocates for sobriety. Their argument was simple and compelling. Alcohol was the root of all evil: crime, poverty, domestic abuse, and unemployment. And honestly, they weren't all that far off. It's worth noting that the WCTU wasn't just about banning booze. They were surprisingly progressive for their time, also advocating for women's suffrage, labor rights, and prison reform. In other words, the same women who were smashing up saloons at a feverish clip could also start a literacy program and organize a voter registration drive. And then there was Carrie Nation, the hatchet-wielding icon of Prohibition. She famously stormed into bars and smashed them to bits, driven by a divine sense of purpose. Her husband once described her as a bulldog running at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like. Carrie was a human freight train, careening through the country's watering holes. By the early 1900s, the Anti-Saloon League had evolved into a formidable political force, lobbying aggressively in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, the WCTU continued its public crusade. A perfect storm was brewing. World War I had created grain shortages, anti-German and Irish sentiment was high, and more Americans began to believe that banning alcohol might lead to a cleaner, more virtuous society. And alas, in 1919, they actually did it. In January of that year, the 18th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors. However, there was a critical loophole. It didn't ban the actual drinking of alcohol. Americans couldn't buy or sell it, but technically, they could still sip like sailors in port. To define what constituted an intoxicating liquor, Congress passed the Volstead Act, which outlawed anything containing more than 0.5% alcohol. To put this into perspective, a bottle of over-the-counter cough syrup has an alcohol content of around 10%, with some coming in at a staggering 20%. But wait, before you melt into a puddle of despair, there was a loophole for that. Doctors could prescribe whiskey as medicine, and if God's your physician, churches could serve wine for communion. Agnostic non-vaxxer. Individuals were allowed to make up to 200 gallons of wine annually for personal use. So you see, there were loopholes abound. On paper, prohibition seemed like a noble idea. In practice, it was a mess. Overnight, America's $2 billion alcohol industry went dark, but demand didn't. It just went underground. Enter the speakeasy, clandestine bars hidden behind bookshelves, basements, or nondescript storefronts. Some required secret passwords, others just a nod from a guy named Vinny. By the mid-1920s, New York City alone boasted more than 30,000 speakeasies, which was around 15 times the number of drinking establishments prior to the start of Prohibition. Now, we're not talking about a sea of Studio 54s, Most were tucked away in personal homes, and some could only host 6 patrons at a time. And while the public snuck into speakeasies, organized crime syndicates moved in to control the new black market. The most infamous of them all was none other than Al Capone. Capone reportedly made $60 million a year smuggling booze in Chicago, equivalent to over $1 billion today. And while he dodged charges for murder and bootlegging, the federal government eventually got him on tax evasion. Talk about anticlimactic. Let that be a lesson. Never underestimate the persistence of an IRS agent. Corruption flourished. More than 10% of Prohibition agents were fired for taking bribes. Some would confiscate alcohol and then sell it right back to gangsters. Law enforcement was often either overwhelmed or in on the action. It was like an early version of The Wire, just with more fedoras and swing music. But while the crime wave was entertaining fodder for newspapers and true crime enthusiasts, the human toll was far less glamorous. Alcohol didn't disappear, it simply became more dangerous. People drank bootleg moonshine, industrial alcohol, and bathtub gin, often laced with methanol. Methanol is highly toxic to humans, and even small amounts can be fatal. As little as 2 tablespoons can be deadly to a child, and 2 to 8 ounces can be deadly for an adult. More than 10,000 Americans died from tainted alcohol during Prohibition. And in a little-known but chilling twist, the US government itself ordered industrial alcohol to be poisoned in an effort to discourage consumption. They called it a deterrent. Critics called it what it was: mass poisoning. By the late 1920s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. The public was disillusioned, law enforcement was stretched thin, and then came the Great Depression in 1929. Suddenly, that lost alcohol tax revenue didn't seem so sinful anymore. Even prominent Prohibition supporters, like John D. Rockefeller Jr., publicly admitted the effort had failed. Newspapers mocked the ban, and by 1930, 75% of Americans supported its repeal. Ironically, even gangsters like Capone favored legalization. It meant fewer turf wars. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president on a platform that included repealing Prohibition. That's how unpopular it had become. Ending a constitutional amendment was a campaign promise. And he delivered. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. America raised its collective glass and more or less said, "Well, that was weird." The end of Prohibition restored billions in tax revenue. It didn't magically erase organized crime, but it helped shift it toward other illicit ventures like gambling, racketeering, and eventually narcotics. The party was over, but the hangover would linger for decades. Fittingly, the 21st Amendment is the only amendment ever passed to repeal another, and it's the only one ratified by state conventions rather than legislatures, a move designed to avoid political delay. The people had spoken, and loudly. In the end, Prohibition was a grand experiment in legislating morality, and a colossal lesson in unintended consequences. It began with the hope of a better, more virtuous America. It ended with black market empires, government poisoning programs, and one of the biggest crime booms in US history. Today, you can buy whiskey at your corner store without a secret handshake, but maybe, just maybe, pour one out for the thousands who couldn't, though preferably not in front of Carrie Nation's ghost. She might still have her hatchet. If you liked this video, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe. And remember, if you feed on facts, you'll never go hungry.